Hi everyone, welcome back to Della. So this is the first video in a series of 5 teaching you how to do fashion design as well as how to then sew the design you've actually drawn. So as I said, this is video 1, and in today's video we're going to start with mood boarding. And mood boards basically infer what designs you're going to create, and they're a really good starting point to spark inspiration for you. The second video will be on collaging. So these mood boards are really important because they kind of kickstart that spark of creativity in order for you to create your collages. I also find mood boarding just in general such a therapeutic process, and this is really enjoyable for me, coming up with all of the concepts for collections, and also it's just a really good way to challenge your brain to think a bit more creatively. This is also the method that professional designers in the industry use. After working for multiple brands, I've seen that this is really the process that works the best and is the most efficient and really pushes your creativity. So let's get started, and I hope you enjoy. So when I want to start designing a collection or a new garment, the first thing that I will do is go to Pinterest. I think I'm quite a visual person, and I think, you know, a lot of creative people are very visual, so it's always great to see so many inspiring images. So as I said, the first thing I do is go on Pinterest and I sit on my homepage for a little bit. And the reason I sit on my homepage is because Pinterest works on an algorithm basis, so this is all recommended images based off my previous searches. So as I said, I'm just going to sit and file through some of these. If I see anything that I like, I will immediately just pin it to an open board of like just general mood boarding at first. And this is just to collate some initial ideas as to what I kind of want the concept of the garment or the collection to be about. I'll just create a new board. As I said, mood board. And as I said, I'm just going to sit and pin anything that's kind of jumping out to me. Okay, so once I feel like I've maxed out on the home screen and I'm not really gaining any more inspiration from this bit, I will go over to the board I've just created. And I will just take an initial file through and see if there's any immediate concepts that are coming to mind. So looking at the board that I've just created, I can kind of see there's a bit of tartan present, there's the colour blue actually is coming up quite a fair bit, we have some gold touches in a few of the images, and a couple of the images have some iridescence in them. There's a lot of texture going on as well in a few of them. So these are all ideas that I'm now going to jot down on a separate piece of paper. So after learning what I just said, I'm just going to jot down the word concept in the middle, and this is how we're going to come up with the concept for either the piece you're creating or the collection you're creating. So I'm just going to jot down those initial ideas that I just talked about. So I said there was quite a few textures, layered textures. We also mentioned there was the theme of blue, iridescence, tartan, gold is another colour that came up, and also corsets with volume. So these are kind of the initial things that we can immediately come up with, and now we're going to try and brainstorm further out, and we're just going to keep pushing ourselves to develop these ideas. So for example, if we think about layered textures, is there anything that would spring to mind for layered textures? I can think of what can I think of? When I think of layered textures, I think of beading and potentially embroidery. I also think of gardens. I guess there's lots of different textures that are going on in a garden. I also think of animals. They have so many textures with their fur and their skin. Also, a really obvious one that you could explore is fabric. There's so many different types of fabric with different textures. So after this, I'm going to move on to the next bullet point. So coming off of the colours, we have blue and gold. Starting with gold, we can immediately think of the sun and this kind of luminosity. We've also got the literal element of gold, so like gold jewellery and coins and things like that. I also think of the sand when I think of gold. For blue, immediately I'm thinking sea. This could be developed to be looking at underwater. It could actually be looking at the surface of the water and the texture on that. Also look at the marine life. Similarly, could also look at the sky, potentially the cloud formations. Then we've got iridescence, and for this my brain is immediately going to fabrics, so I'm thinking like a sheer material, maybe something like tulle or chiffon. Something else that's iridescent is I'm thinking of kind of the skin of insects and things like that, reptiles. I'm also thinking of, again, where I said the surface of the water, I think that really gives off an iridescence. So we have some key ideas there for iridescence. Moving on to corsets. Immediately when I think of corsets, I think Vivienne Westwood. I think she was a key player with the corset. We also have the origin of corsets, which is from the late Renaissance to the 20th century. And they were most commonly worn by royalty, actually. So that could be something to explore, and that ties nicely in with the gold over here and the layered textures. Corsets also make me think of the word restriction. So that's a key word that could be explored. And like fastenings. Could be some kind of play with zips here. And then we have volume below. Immediately I'm thinking kind of air and like space in terms of like kind of the space around. Volume, I'm also thinking like liquids. That could be explored with different experiments that you could do on paper with paint. In terms of tartan, this could obviously go down the line of Scottish, could look into kilts. Again, Vivienne, key player with the tartan. Ooh, just thinking for underwater over here where the sea is. McQueen did a good show called Atlantis, Plato's Atlantis, which was really, really good, and that's all to do with marine and underwater. Coming back to tartan, we have a kind of busyness that goes on with tartan and like clashing colours. It's like it could be even a bit avant-garde. So these are my initial brainstorm thoughts, and what I'm now going to do is kind of have a think over each of them and see if there's any I particularly want to research further into. Immediately I'm kind of drawn towards looking more at the sea and kind of looking at this surface of the water and underwater kind of concept. This also kind of plays into the iridescence. I think that could be a nice tie that's going to go with the water. Something else I'm feeling actually quite interested in is looking at the layered textures and looking a bit deeper into gardens. I think there are so many different species of plant and flower that could be really interesting to look at, and you can actually get so much concept development from looking at different pictures. So yeah, immediately I'm going to go back to Pinterest now, and I'm going to further research into gardens and also into the sea and looking at underwater research. Okay, so we've just come back to Pinterest from our little mind map that we did here. Apologies if you can't read my writing, but I hope I explained it well enough. And we're going to further look into, as I said, the sea and also gardens. So what I'm going to do to make this very clear for myself is create 2 different sections on Pinterest. So if you just go to the plus at the bottom and press add section, I can call one sea, and I can add another one called gardens. Now, the way I end up kind of choosing my concept in the end is typically I am more drawn to some images over others. So I'm just going to sit here for the next half an hour and see what ends up in both categories more. Do I feel more inspired by the sea? There are a lot more pins saved here, or is it the gardens? So what I'm going to do is any that immediately made me think of the sea or of a garden, the pins that we initially did, I'm going to move into each category. Okay, so I've just moved my initial pins into one of the 2 categories, and I'm now going to go into gardens and then press more ideas and see if any of this is something that I'm feeling inspiration from. I've hit a very exciting point, and I'm really interested in this particular image here, and I feel like it kind of reminds me of a flower fairy garden or something along the lines of this. So I feel like this is where I want to explore the most now, and I got there through kind of a whole process of looking at close-up organisms and then looking at these kind of butterfly close-ups of the wings, and then that naturally kind of led me into different artistic expressions. And then I dived here onto the surface of the flowers, and that led me into looking at more of an overall kind of artistic expression of a garden, and then that led on to the fairy in the garden on this page here. So I'm going to continue exploring this particular category now in the gardens, and that's kind of one of my options. That also has immediately made me think of the Flower Fairy books from when you were a kid, so I'm just going to research those and pin the ones I'm most drawn to. So I've just pinned a couple of the ones that I was most drawn to, and now I feel like we have a really good basis for our concept for the gardens. So now what I would like to do is look specifically at garment inspiration as well as colour and fabric inspiration. So I'm going to do the 3 categories separately, and we already have a bit of the garment inspiration here from the little fairies, but this is something I'm going to look into a bit further. So I'm going to specifically look into some designers that have done kind of whimsical concepts. This feels quite whimsical. There's something delicate about this as well from Jean-Paul Gaultier. So I'm just going to refer back to the board again and see what we have. So if I wanted to do some further development work later on after the mood board, I would kind of pick a specific flower to focus on maybe. So I might gather some images of the forget-me-not. There's something about this as well where it's like, makes me think about the kind of the circle of life. Okay, so in terms of our garment inspiration, I feel like we have enough there to work with from a mood board now. And in terms of colour and fabric selection, my favourite source of inspiration for this has always personally been Vivienne Westwood. I think if you just search up different designers, you can kind of file through all of the different Fashion Week shows and see if there's any that particularly take your fancy. But I've always been drawn to Vivienne Westwood's use of tartan, so I'm going to save a few of those pins. I think we have a pretty cohesive amount of pins now for the gardens side of our research, and I'm now going to go and explore the sea and see if there's any more or less inspiration coming to me for this category. So immediately when I go on this board, I'm kind of getting the sense of underwater creatures. This is kind of giving me kind of an interesting fish. So I think that would be interesting to explore the different marine life underneath. Again, this is kind of giving me different textures of fish. This is kind of giving me, I'm kind of thinking in the depths of the ocean, you know, we don't really know what's down there, and this would be interesting to explore a bit further. These lockets and kind of watches I kind of automatically associated with treasure. I think that could be quite an interesting thing to explore. And again, the different use of pattern on the tights I think is very interesting. This also kind of lends itself towards fish scales or something. So I'm going to explore each of those. I'm just going to go into more ideas and see if there's anything within here. So going back to my kind of board with all of the inspiration images on it, again, I've naturally kind of come to a point where I'm very excited by a concept, and I've kind of explored going down the line of mermaids. I think this is a very exciting concept, and there's quite a lot that can be done here. I quite like the idea of going more down the siren route, where it's a bit darker and it's kind of a bit more gothic mermaid-esque. As I feel like this kind of actually ties all of these images in together. We've got like a bit of the iridescence with a siren, we've got all of the treasures, we've got a bit of kind of Vivienne Westwood hauntness, which I think is very exciting. I'd love to tie in kind of some of these tights. So yeah, I think we've reached a good point here as well. So now I'm going to grab a piece of paper and kind of see what my final ideas are for both concepts. Now we have our two concepts. We have deep sea sirens as the first category, and then we will have kind of flower fairy. Both kind of fantasy, actually. I only just realised. So I'm just going to explore kind of the kind of fundamental things I'm going to need to put on my mood board, and this will infer my concept development afterwards in terms of collaging and kind of coming up with initial design ideas. So in terms of the garment inspiration, we've obviously got kind of the initial mermaid shape, which we can go off. We also like sirens. I think they're kind of known to be a bit more like angular, I guess that's the word I'm looking for. So I could look more at angles and kind of play with the shape a bit more, distorted shape. I could also look at shells as garment inspo and the shape of the shell. I can play with this on the photocopier as well at a later date. We've also obviously got sea creatures, which we can add to the mood board to infer shape design. and we have kind of the movement of water in general. I feel like once developed, these are some really strong kind of starting points for shape inspiration. And then in terms of colour, obviously there will be a use of blue in here, but I think it could be quite interesting to pick some other colours out that could either contrast or complement blue quite nicely. So we will put blue down, but I think it could be quite exciting to have like a really bright silver or something. And looking at the images that I've saved, there is kind of these pops of like a gold orange, so maybe putting orange on the mood board could be nice. And there is kind of a consistent theme of purple, which I feel like is quite a classic mermaid colour, so we could potentially change this to red, which feels a bit more like siren energy. And then the classic black, I think, for the siren. In terms of fabrics, we obviously could use a chiffon, which feels very relevant for kind of mermaids and water, as it's very fluid fabric. But I kind of want to contrast that because of the siren feels like quite a strong character and quite a strong species actually. So we could either stiffen it with like a boning in the chiffon, so it kind of contradicts there, or we could actually contrast the fabric to a stiffer fabric. So that's two options we could use. I would also like to include a bit of tartan in there, and we could potentially try and embellish some fabrics dependent on what we decide our design is in the end, or embroider. And for the kind of flower fairy concept, our garment or shape inspo, this kind of mainly comes from the actual flower fairy, and then as a result also the flowers. Also kind of went down the route of a more witchy flower fairy, so we could kind of look into witches a bit more. And Simone Rocha for kind of some silhouette inspo, she uses a lot of volume. And for the deep sea one, actually we can look at McQueen. I think it could also actually be interesting to press some flowers into the photocopier for some further research. And then in terms of colour, I think from the board that we were just kind of looking at on Pinterest, there's quite a lot of green and also purple. These kind of feel like the two key colours, and then we have some accents of gold from the jewellery that I saved. In terms of fabric on this side, we could work with some tulle again, or chiffon, but I kind of feel like this is going to be draped over something, so it's kind of like a layering effect. So this could potentially go over like a cotton. I'm also kind of drawn towards lace over this side. Okay, so these are the two options that we've kind of like delved into. Obviously, you can really push your development ideas here, so you could sit and really work these into the ground for quite a while, and you could work through a sketchbook. But for time purposes, I'm just gonna decide from kind of the lists I've just created. So I feel like we have a stronger sense of identity for a concept here on this side with the deep sea siren concept. So I think this is the one that I'm going to go for, in which case I'm going to go and pin all of the pins on Pinterest and print them out, and I'm also going to add any of these extra kind of colour ideas that I had that aren't on that board. Okay, so I've printed off all of my images from the Pinterest board, and I'm now going to cut them out. I actually like to cut them out kind of like actually around each object, but you can either cut the whole image out or do what I'm doing. It's completely up to you. Okay, so now I've cut all of the images out, what I'm going to do is just arrange them on the page before I stick anything down for definite. So here is the final mood board, and as you can see, I feel like there is quite a clear vision here as to what our concept is at the moment. And this is a really great starting point. We have so many different things going on here which can really inspire our collages, like this volume in this skirt here with the corset and the tartan. This is a Vivienne Westwood piece, beautiful. I love the colours and the contrast here of her white lashes with the green. I think there's something really kind of cool about this, and the same with the iridescent purple on her lips. Love the shape of these shoes. I thought those were really interesting. We've got some prints here, different shells, more prints again. We obviously have these mystical kind of mermaids going on. This really reminds me of kind of siren mermaid vibe, and again all this iridescence is beautiful. I love this webbing as well. I was thinking about gloves or something that could be made inspired by this, and also the gold treasures and jewelry of the sea. So there's so much here we can really work with, and yeah, we'll be moving on to our collages in the next video, and we can pick all of these different elements out and bring them together. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed learning how to mood board and how I personally mood board, and I hope you're excited to move on to the second video, which will be about collaging your ideas together to kind of inform design decisions, which is very exciting. So I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!